Hello and welcome to a discussion of Chapter 2 of Streitmatter's Mightier Than the Sword, Abolition, Turning America's Conscience Against the Sins of Slavery. You'll recognize this figure from our discussion of the last chapter and Thomas Paine's African Slavery in America, published in 1775. Was among the first articles published in the United States to advocate abolition. So in November of 1837, when Elijah Lovejoy was murdered by a pro-slavery mob, the fight to abolish slavery had been going on for some time. But Lovejoy's death transformed the nature of the abolition movement by transforming the nature of the fight. As Streitmatter points out, he did not die in vain. His martyrdom propelled thousands of converts into the abolition movement, as his murder clearly demonstrated that an anti-slavery stand endangered not only the rights of African Americans, but the civil liberties of all Americans, white as well as black. In other words, the death of Lovejoy has transformed the cause of abolition from a special interest cause to a general interest cause. It is recognized that from this point forward that pro-slavery forces are willing to interfere and suppress the civil rights of anyone who challenges the institution of slavery. Lovejoy was among the pioneers in the abolitionist press. The cause of abolition would not be taken up by the mainstream press, and even then only by a minority of newspapers. That fight would not be taken up by the mainstream press until the 1850s. The figures that we will examine in addition to Lovejoy include the most influential of abolitionist editors, William Lloyd Garrison, Maria Stuart, and Frederick Douglass. As you discover in reading this chapter, the methods of the abolitionist editors are not too different from the methods of Adams and Paine before them. They tend to make emotional appeals in order to make their case to ordinary citizens, but it is at the point of Lovejoy's death that the threat to civil liberties begins to swell the ranks of the abolitionist cause as a response to attempts on the part of pro-slavery forces to squash efforts to debate the institution of slavery in the context of our professed democratic values. The Southern slave interests sought to prevent a full and open debate on the issue, largely by intimidating those who would speak or write in favor of abolition, and thereby they threatened freedom of speech and freedom of the press. It also should be noted that supporters of slavery engaged in a disinformation campaign arguing that slavery actually improved the condition of blacks by, on the one hand, introducing a backward people to Christian civilization, and on the other arguing that slavery provided food, clothing, and shelter to slaves even into their old age. These arguments, of course, tended to ignore the inhumanity of slavery, and many of the issues that abolitionists were concerned about. Abolitionists argued, for example, that slaves could not benefit from their own labor. They could not enjoy a secure family life. They could be sold and separated at the whim of their owners, and they could not prepare their souls for eternity. In many of the slave states, it was a crime to teach a slave to read and write, and so they could not read the Bible for themselves, and as a result, in the minds of abolitionists, they could not develop a personal relationship with their Savior, so they could not prepare their souls for eternity. Lovejoy became an abolitionist after witnessing a slave burned at the stake, and so he established a newspaper in Missouri in 1834 and was met with strong opposition by other newspapers. The Missouri Republican all but explicitly called for violence against Lovejoy, writing, for example, every consideration for their own and their neighbors' prosperity requires them to stop the course of the Observer. Lovejoy, on the other hand, embraced the Free Press Clause of the First Amendment and wrote, "As long as I am an American citizen, and as long as American blood runs in these veins, I shall hold myself at liberty to speak, to write, and to publish whatever I please on any subject. If civil authorities refuse to protect me, I must look to God, and if I die, I have determined to make my grave in Alton. I have sworn eternal opposition to slavery, and by the blessing of God, I will never turn back." Lovejoy was the perfect martyr for the cause, as tragic as his death was, as Streitmatter pointed out, and as we mentioned earlier, it did energize the cause. The death of Lovejoy, who was a well-educated Eastern-born clergyman, and the failure of the local law enforcement officials to arrest anyone for his murder. That is, the very notion that this was an officially sanctioned murder sent shockwaves through the nation, as Streitmatter writes, and gave the abolitionist cause much needed support from public figures such as John Quincy Adams, who said of Lovejoy's death that it had given a shock as of an earthquake throughout this continent, which will be felt in the most distant regions of the earth. And whether it was felt in the most distant regions of the earth or not, it was felt throughout the nation and shaped the nature of the abolition movement from that time forward. The fact that he died heroically defending his press transformed the struggle, as we said, from the narrow interest of the freedom of African slaves in the U.S. to the broader question of the civil liberty of everyone in the U.S. is an important move in garnering greater support for the cause of abolition. Garrison wrote, "In destroying Lovejoy's press, the enemies of freedom have compelled 1,000 to speak out in its stead. And truly, the reach of Lovejoy's press in his death was much greater than the reach of his press had been in his lifetime. His death became the topic of sermons by many ministers in pulpits throughout the North. Activists put on public protest in support of the First Amendment, and Lovejoy became known as the first martyr to American liberty, murdered for asserting the freedom of the press. Everyone's civil liberties were imperiled. In addition to bringing more support to the cause, Lovejoy's death transformed the movement from one of moral suasion, from one of attempting to persuade people by moral argument that slavery is wrong and therefore should be ended, to one of direct action, to one of direct confrontation of the pro-slavery forces. And these are two very significant events for the cause, the transformation of the nature of the argument. It's now no longer merely an argument about whether or not African slaves in the United States should be freed, but one of whether or not we can continue to protect the civil liberties of all Americans under the threat posed by pro-slavery forces that will do anything to silence those abolitionist voices, and this transformation of method from simple moral persuasion to a direct confrontation, which is essential in setting the stage for a willingness to go to war over the question of slavery. William Lloyd Garrison, who is, as I said earlier, the most prominent, the most famous of the abolitionist editors, was uncompromising in his position on slavery. He wrote, "I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." He had begun his work as an abolitionist in the 1820s, working on the genius of universal emancipation in Baltimore. A column by Garrison called The Blacklist resulted in a lawsuit for libel against Garrison and his fellow editor Lundy, which was filed in Maryland in order to be sure that they had the advantage of a pro-slavery court, and of course the ruling was against Garrison. And the state of Maryland, in addition to the civil suit, brought criminal charges against Garrison, quickly finding him guilty and ordering him to pay a fine of $50 and court costs. Garrison was unable to pay the fine and was sentenced to a jail term of 6 months. So criminal libel, this was a significant charge that forced Garrison's hand, and he was forced to move further north in order to put more of a buffer between himself and the pro-slavery forces of the southern states.